Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com, and this is our 21st episode of our Performance Concepts Chat. And in this episode, we're speaking with Carl Valle, and we've had Carl on before, so he's kind of like the Alec Baldwin Saturday Night Live kind of equivalent for our podcast. But anyways, what we're talking about today is the consulting field in sports performance right now. And the reason we did this talk was a dual purpose approach, where one, you have individuals, many of them friends of mine, who are experts in different aspects of the field. And they're looking to connect with teams, sports organizations, to figure out how they can help, how they can add value. The other side of the coin is I also know a lot of people working in professional sports with major teams. And sometimes they have very specific questions that they can't answer with their internal staff. They have to look outside of those that are employed by the team and bring somebody in who might have a fresh idea. So when talking to Carl about this, the idea was, okay, well, how do you do this? What are you looking for? And even this idea that you can add so much value by bringing people in. And for me, Al Vermeil was a big influence on me, and I know that he was constantly bringing different experts in to help supplement his knowledge. And he did this all the way from the early 80s all the way, even beyond the late 90s. And so they had already won a bunch of championships, but he still, if anything, he was picking up more and more momentum of bringing more people in. And this thirst for knowledge on Al's part was pretty incredible. So, there are going to be some limitations for this sometimes, and it's not always necessarily just going to be budget. Do teams define a budget? Is that something that a general manager or athletic director will give in terms of professional development funding or assisting staff, or do they think, well, we should be able to handle this internally? So budget is always a big issue. Sometimes it's just security. I know myself, I want to find the best people who know things that I don't know. And I think that's really important to recognize that we can't know everything. We can try to be a generalist, but when you're a generalist, it kind of dilutes, the expertise that you can then have in every area. So I think that's important to recognize that, hey, other people can help build my knowledge base and help the organization I'm working with. So that's what we're really discussing, and there are specific areas that could be examined, and Carl touches on these things, whether it's technology, a specific rehab or medical issue that you're looking at, or a very, very, very specific type of training. And lastly, maybe somebody helping on the global planning side. But these are the issues we get into. I think it was a pretty interesting discussion. I don't want people to think that, we're trying to drum up business for ourselves. I think it's more an awareness issue that we're bringing about, and whether it's sport, whether it's other, fields out there, whether it's, the financial field, the engineering or technology, I think we're all trying to look for people that are smarter than ourselves to help build our knowledge base. So I think you'll really get something out of this, and it might start you thinking about how you can increase your knowledge base and get people involved. And it's not always just about going to a conference or reading a book. You have to bring somebody in, have some FaceTime one-on-one, learn from them, and figure out how you can turn around and apply that knowledge. So really hope you enjoy this talk.
Hey, Carl. Nice to touch base with you again. This is becoming a regular thing, which is not a bad thing. I think you have a lot to offer. So we're going to fire some pretty pointed questions at you today about this whole concept of consulting in sport, particularly, obviously, at the higher levels, pro sport, upper levels of college sport, and other sports organizations, Olympic level organizations. And I have a funny story about a guy I had coffee with who said, hey, I got an offer to do some consulting in North Korea with their sports organizations. And I'm like, well, it's nice knowing you. Anyways, I think I have a list of questions here I want to go over with you and kind of engage you. But I think one of the big questions is, whenever you hire a consultant, there's obviously a perceived need to bring somebody in. But why would a pro team bring in a consultant over just hiring another staff member? Like, I'm sure, everybody feels like they're spending lots of money on their staff, and we want to hire the best staff, and we want the best team behind our players. So under what circumstances would you see bring in a consultant to add value to that scenario?
Yeah, that's a common question. Why bring in a consultant when you can just hire them full time? So I think there's a big differentiation between outsourcing expertise just to help with the heavy lifting, and most teams are looking for an individual that has experience working with many teams, so they could better understand the 30,000-foot view of what the problems are. So what we commonly see is a consultant that comes in not only with years of experience, but many different clients, different leagues, so they have a more well-rounded perspective, different teams, so that they can provide a crowdsourcing opportunity to learn from everyone, because the consultant is not about just educating others, they're also learning along the way. So that's what they're trying to do, is teams are trying to look at someone that has far more experience collectively than that linear approach internally.
Yeah, and I would add that obviously if you're bringing a consultant in, they might have a very, very specific niche that maybe in a general sense your staff don't have. Like what are some examples of just, bringing in somebody with a very specific niche?
Common question is you'll get someone that has specialized information on rare either medical information. An example would be maybe sports podiatry. I work with a consultant myself. I hire him and teams hire him to do things that maybe a medical professional internally or a specialist in the area might not know. So sometimes when people are looking for that competitive edge, they're looking at really very narrow areas of expertise that you simply aren't going to get from the local city. So that's one example. Another example is on the technology side. One example would be Jose Fernandez, someone that has a lot of experience with tensormyography, and then how many people have access to that type of technology in order to have that experience. And he's tested so many different teams. His knowledge is beyond just someone just coming in there to test. You're not hiring a consultant usually to do dirty work. You're usually hiring them to provide insight to something that you couldn't do on your own.
Yeah, that's a good point. And even with some of the sleep and science consultants we've talked to, I mean, that's something that's very specific. And, while we all know sleep is important, how to monitor it, how to analyze the data, I think that's something that a lot of people just don't have a handle on right now. So that's perfect. What is different from conventional consulting to modern sports performance consulting? How is that, how do you have to frame that differently if you're coming in and working with a team?
So what we're seeing is a paradigm shift from, the kind of like the lawyer billing, where it's like an hourly discussion, or you're not really exchanging for time, because the issue is that a consultant wants more hours for billing, and the organization wants to have less time and get more out of what they're getting. So usually what we're seeing is an intensive educational experience. So a consultant will come in and tailor the information that they know based upon the environment of the team. So if how many staff people you have, access to either space or equipment, those type of things. They're trying to tailor and customize instead of just scale a package program or just spend 2 days brainstorming. You're seeing a migration away from that, because ideas are a dime a dozen. People are looking for results, and usually applications that are realistic and sustainable.
Yeah, and again, when you're dealing with human beings, it's not as easy as just saying, okay, here are my findings, here's my report, you're fine, go and run with it. There has to be some sort of iterative conversation and how are things going, and a support quality, I think, that is very imperative nowadays in some of these sporting situations, particularly when you're looking at rehab scenarios or return to play scenarios, and there's such heavy individualization required. what are different types of consultants in your mind? Like, obviously, it's very cut and dried if you bring in somebody who's a speed expert and to update your speed plans. But what other variations are there going to be within the consulting field?
So usually we see a medical side, a performance side, and then sometimes you have like a sport tactical type where if you look at Bill Walsh before he, years before he passed away, he was brought in as a special consultant. And usually that's just kind of just exchanging back and forth, okay? And that's usually what happens with team coaches. They're trying to refine an offense, or, Tex Winter was always been seen as a coach, but really sometimes the fine line between coach full-time and consultant, they're very similar because sometimes an assistant's there just to exchange ideas, or if you have someone that doesn't want to have those coaching hours, you bring them in to throw ideas back and forth. On the medical side, you're going to have specialized information when you have a complex injury where you have a superstar and you just need a team resource approach. Other things are you have, like we said earlier, the recovery side. You might bring in someone for nutrition because you feel that you have a nutritionist that's really knowledgeable, but you bring in someone that really understands like meal preparation. Or like, for example, there's a gentleman in sports nutrition that really understands facilities and, buying for football teams and, an efficient cafeteria, very specialized information. So usually you don't see someone that's going to give you, something that's redundant. You want to go and drill down deeper and those people are able to give information that's so much more finite and also specific, so that it's not just casual advice. They'll tell you what to order if it's supplementation because they're working with supplement companies and they know what's going down in terms of the pipeline, and those are the type of things that we're seeing now.
Yeah, and if I bring somebody in, if I'm a staff member and I say I really need to bring this guy in, what are the negative implications, potentially negative implications of bringing somebody in to kind of supplement what you're doing?
Yeah, and that's something that when coaches are looking to expand their abilities, either what they're looking for is information, and sometimes that's bringing someone in to do continuing education. So during the hiring process, a lot of coaches are very clear, and sometimes they don't. They ask for professional development. So the question is, when a consultant comes in, is it an in-house educational workshop, or are you contracting out to do a service, saying, hey, we just don't want to deal with it. Could you, almost like outsourcing? And then they add what I call added value. So what we see with a lot of these monitoring devices and equipment is someone that has a coaching background, someone that has a sports psychology background, and they can give added value to the data that you have. So it's not a technology consultant per se. Technology is just the medium usually to collect data. It's usually someone that says, hey, you have the technology to have objective information. I can come in there and provide intervention strategies. I can provide other ways to have you implement that information better.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know from my interactions with Al Vermeil, and he's taught me a lot of things. And I was fortunate enough to have him send me videos of what he captured when he would bring people in. So he had different examples. Like he would have the boardroom video that he'd send me of him with somebody like Carmelo Bosco, and they sit down and go through training theory and evaluation and testing. He had Mel Siff, sitting down and they're just talking training. And then there were other scenarios where he would be filming weightlifting coach Sorosalin, and he would be doing weightlifting techniques and showing the staff how to do certain types of Olympic weightlifting techniques. Dragomir Sorosalin, and then other cases he had Charlie Francis there teaching how to do sprint mechanics and all that. So it was very interesting to see what Al had done in terms of bringing people in to educate himself, his staff, and just provide value added, like you said. So that's the way I kind of see it. And I don't know if everybody does it that way. Maybe some coaches are bringing people in to fill the needs that they don't want to address, like you said. But I do like the idea of this continuing education, and a lot of professional coaches don't have the time to go out to professional development events, and may choose not to, which is fine too. Maybe they want to be a little more private, but I think bringing somebody in can really fill that void.
And usually the solution is, and this is a great point, is that with continuing education, you might not be able to go to a conference because you're in the middle of your competitive season.
Yeah.
Also, coaches that are working obscene hours, they have a problem with, okay, you just spent, the entire season on the road, and now you're going to go on the road again to learn. So, yeah, you're right. There's an educational component where someone's telling you what to do or how better to do things. We see that a lot with on the medical side when people are learning how to do assessments of torn labrums of the hip or whatever. How to determine whether it's just an athlete having wear and tear and something that's you really need surgery, or this person's not going to walk normal. I mean, that's the medical side. And as a coaching side, usually you're coming in to have someone survey their training program and say, hey, there's an imbalance of loading here. You see that with a lot of sports scientists now, that people, it's sort of like a jet. You can't afford one, so you timeshare it pretty much. And that's what you're seeing, is how to take advantage of resources smarter.
Yeah. And if I'm a pro team or I'm a strength coach within a pro team or a sports scientist within a pro team, what would you say is the best way for me to find and hire a consultant? Is that something where you're trying to identify a network of people where these are the experts and these are the people I want to bring in? What is the best way? I mean, obviously you want to be able to trust that, bring this person into your environment and have them provide value added without creating any sort of negative implications for, bringing them in. Because I know a lot of strength coaches are a little wary about bringing certain individuals in because they're so outspoken, and perhaps that might, reflect badly. What's your thought on how you hire somebody, find the right person?
Yeah, so that's a good point. There's three perspectives. I've been part of the process to hire consultants. So I was brought in technically as a consultant, so I could find the proper talent that might be adding a lot of value to the organization. Clearly, I was hired to do a job from different sports teams. And then also for myself, for my own athletes, I've hired, some great people and just simply said, okay, just either go out to them to get work done, either medically, rehab, or even training. I did that much earlier in my career on the training side. Now I'm spending most of my time taking in, the wounded athlete. And before I want to start training them, I really want to make sure that they're evaluated properly. And they have to do a little bit of jet setting because there's a finite amount of talent and expertise out there. So the first thing politically is what people are scared of. If I bring in a consultant, does that mean I'm missing some sort of knowledge, or it's going to make me look bad? I think that it's the reverse, that you have such a understanding of what you can and cannot do. The sign of a good organization is knowing when to outsource and when to keep things internal. So they have a really good understanding of things internally. Then you can decide what to do there. A lot of coaches are saying, well, if I bring in a consultant on, for example, program design or periodization or loading, which is really popular now because of GPS, does it show that I don't understand what I'm doing? And I think that coaches need to, in order to take advantage of the market, which is a really expansive opportunity, you have to start looking at it as not that we're trying to cover a gap, but create a gap. So instead of saying, well, we have a shortcoming in our knowledge or abilities, to say, hey, in order for us to get better quickly based upon what the competition of the other 30 teams in the league or conferences for college, etc., what we really need to do is find a secret weapon, someone that really has either specialized information or really wide information so they can be really, wise and sane with their decision making. Someone has maybe a lot of experience with a lot of different things can give a great vantage point, or someone that really is just really narrow. I'm working with someone that does only he has expertise in thermotherapies, which is the reason is because everyone's so shying away from ice baths that now they're coming back in vogue again because people are talking about the brain, perceptual fatigue, travel fatigue. That's something you can't really measure as well as satellite cells in the muscle. So we're seeing now the pendulum swinging back and forth on this hiring process. Some people try to keep things secret and build internally and just hire a huge, massive amount of staff. And that's one way to do it because they're really secretive. Some are more open, say, hey, we all have the same problems. We just want to make sure that we can get the best information, and they want to grow quicker versus trying to grow bigger.
Now, if we talk specifically more about your experiences hiring consultant, being a consultant, I just want to get into some of the nitty gritty of your own experiences, and I can share some of mine as well. I mean, I know I've been involved in examples where I've been brought in probably more on the professional development side. And sometimes I wondered, am I just being brought in to give the impression that the staff is trying to grow their knowledge? And any recommendations I've put forward, I don't know if they've necessarily been implemented. So I don't know. It's very interesting sometimes for me. I know some people like unstructured environments where hey, just come out, just hang out with us, we'll talk. And I don't mind that. I like, obviously, it ending with some more actionable recommendations, that we can evaluate. But, what is your experience on that?
So what you just shared was what we typically call an audit. Someone doesn't really have any glaring weaknesses. Usually those coaches are really well-rounded, and that's why they're successful. They cover the bases. And so they're looking to, instead of adding width, they want to go more depth. Hey, how can we refine something? So with those type of people, hey, come out, see a game, watch practice, watch training, watch the medical side. And those casual ones are actually pretty good because they know that they don't know something. They say, hey, we don't know where we are. Where could you compare us to the rest of the league, which is always dangerous because usually the league's problems are constraints of the league, not of the coaches. A collective bargain agreement. So those approaches are good starting vehicles to getting what I consider, the specialized outsourcing. You go in there, you notice that, for example, hey, we have a recovery room. And you go in there, and there's no organization of it. There's there's some Normatec leg pants out there. There's some, a bath, a hot bath, or there's some sort of a float tank, whatever. And that's good, but there's no refinement of the process. They're not taking advantage of things. They're not leveraging things. They're not even recording things. For example, a lot of recovery units aren't monitored like GPS style practices. So you have all this data on the training loads, but on the recovery side, you just say, okay, well, we have some receipts of our tart cherry juice that we ordered, but they don't really have an applied recording of the data. So those are just some casual examples that are something you can see, throughout the leagues.
Have there been ever situations where you're invited in and you observe what's going on, and then it may not be anywhere near optimal? You see some glaring errors, some technical issues, extreme misuse of technology, and where they turn around and say, so what do you think? And how do you frame that in a situation where you don't want to say, well, this is an absolute gong show, but you want to provide value added and obviously maintain your relationship with this group? What's the best way to put that kind of information forward in a productive manner?
Yeah, that's very delicate, because if you're critical, then it doesn't feel good. I mean, I brought people in knowing that it's going to hurt. I've sent workouts out and said, hey, even though that you're not seeing how they're being done, is there something on paper that just looks like it's not jiving? And that's humbling, because when you see multiple perspectives and everyone agrees that there's a glaring hole, then you have to move on it. But, being in the technology side, we're all familiar with debugging, but that's what we're doing. The community of technology really supports exchange of mistakes. They want to know this. Yet in the coaching community, it's like, oh, well, we're in the trenches, or you don't understand what it's like they're looking for feedback, but they don't want to change. And, the age-old discussion of, hey, I just want someone to agree with me is usually what they want. They want a rah-rah person to say, hey, great job, you're doing good. And it gives them a comfort, because they have now an outside but biased perspective. What I've been seeing is a major trend is you can tell a pattern of hiring process. The hiring process really determines whether you're getting the most qualified people, and if you're getting a good network of qualified people versus coming from like you've kind of intercepted a successful team and try to take all their assistants, seeing if you can get some of the benefits close to the tree, because you got pieces of the fruit. And for example, usually you see an assistant coach leave and they bring in the assistant strength coach. Well, that's good and bad. It's great to have someone that you trust and know, but then you kind of inbreed. You're not going to really have any type of innovation when you're only within your own inner circle. You want to have cross-pollination by hiring people even out of the country. Now, what we are seeing is a retraction. You're seeing a lot of sports scientists that were coming from Europe, coming from Australia, and people are realizing that the further away someone is, they're not more of an expert.
Remember, Simi, no one here can know I am royalty. You must appear to be no different than the average man.
I will not say a word.
British Airways Flight 929 to London is now boarding at 8:15.
I mean, a Bob Alejo type person who is not a sports scientist, reads a lot of the research, but understands strength and conditioning, what you can do within a program, is probably a better high-performance advisor than some sports scientist that is very ivory tower based. Conversely, you want to get someone that is rich in the ivory tower because they're reading the research. And it's amazing that people might download a PDF and glance over it, but they're not really trying to acquire the information. They just want to have something to defend what they're doing. So they're not looking at the materials, they're not looking at the population. They're just trying to make sure that they're not doing something wrong.
But wouldn't you agree that there is obviously an extreme art to this selection of an appropriate person to bring in, where I think in your Bob Alejo example, I think he's a perfect guy to be able to identify what the potential environments are that you're bringing somebody into. Like, he's familiar, he's been around the block, he knows what might be the best fit. Whereas if you just bring in the sports scientists and drop them into an environment that's not conducive to what they were in previously, it could end very badly. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, it's been a catastrophe for some teams where they really didn't take advantage of the resource of the sports scientists, so they failed there. And then, of course, the sports scientist has polluted, what was working, because, their experience was maybe from another sport, and they had a good idea on paper, but the results aren't there. And you can see that because, especially on team sport, you always try to bring an Olympic sport guy because, it's exciting, someone from the Australian Institute of Sport, which is, to me, a game changer if you can collectively use that. For example, the Philadelphia 76ers brought in someone from a background in cycling. And I read his research years ago about, he's looking at, the actual red blood cell and, the membrane, and he's doing amazing stuff. So really important on the conditioning side. But is he an expert in, an example would be jumper's knee, basketball with knee pathologies. Would you bring in something that's more medically driven than sports science driven? or probably the biggest solution is to bring in a classic strength coach and put all your eggs into that basket, because there's a joke. The no barbell association, the biggest, most potent way to help a league that doesn't train is to focus on training when you do have that narrow window of opportunity. So a guy that's from a rugby strength and conditioning coach might be the utopian pickup for a team like like a NBA team. And then, for example, you might want to have for a soccer club more of an NFL guy, because you can see how strength and conditioning really can help improve a game that's becoming more power and speed oriented, right? So, those are some ideas.
But it's interesting you say that. Like, intuitively, I think we know that even when examining a training program, bringing in more of the same is not necessarily the best thing. So in your case here, with your examples, you said, well, let's bring somebody from a different background to supplement what's already being done. And I think that's a pretty valuable perspective. And so my next question would be, we talked about having a consultant come in to hire another consultant or make other hires. I think this is a very important role for a consultant, is to identify as an external person, because all the nepotism that can occur within hiring processes. If you can bring an external person in with a fresh idea on looking at the bigger picture of what's happening in your organization, I think that's a huge, kind of opportunity from a consultant's point of view, is to come in, look at what you have, who are your experts, who can add value from a human resources point of view, whether it's a consultant, whether it's a new staff member, because we've seen what's happened when it's left to the devices of a head coach to bring in his buddies and bring in the posse, and especially at the college football level, where it's resulted in disaster and potentially damaging the university's reputation. What do you say on that?
Yeah, and it's weird, because what I like to do is to see, how long is the gap between when they finally make it. If you look at the past of, let's say, always like to use the example of football because I'm a little bit more knowledgeable there. But I like to look at someone's Wikipedia entry and see how far back they were, like when they were GA. And then they bring in, 10, 15 years later, someone that they knew then. They say, hey, I finally made it. I'm bringing all the people that were there to help me get there, which was sometimes noble. That's really great. If someone said, hey, Carl, I want to give you some something back. You helped me out back in 1995. I like that. That's nice to do, but is it appropriate? Did I lose my fastball and I'm, doing another career and I'm coming back, or did my thought process change and we're not really on the same wavelength? So we're seeing a lot of that. And you say it's nepotism. Clearly, if you look at the last names of people being hired, but it's even worse on the sports performance and medical side, because as a head coach, you can kind of understand what the assistant coaches are doing. That's your neck of the woods. I don't understand how a strength coach is being hired by someone that's not even close to the day-to-day operations. So what you'll see is some random sports performance staff member. I won't really give a label, because sometimes if I give the exact one, you'll narrow it down to a handful of people. But you're everyone's saying at the bars, how did that guy get the job, right? And people are just confused because they know that person more than the people that hired them. And they're saying, wow, what did he do? How did he get in? Was it LinkedIn profile? Was it some presentation he did at a conference? How is that person getting that job? Or that guy gets a job every year and keeps finding a way to get the new job. He keeps getting fired, but he's like a cockroach, keeps going. So you can say that, this is not new. The question is, how do you evaluate a consultant? And I think that with a consultant, what you're doing is you're looking at to say, hey, let's take a very small thing, and what are the deliverables? How do you measure success with a consultant? And it's usually Either two things. There's a specific outcome goal, like our goal is to decrease hamstring injuries. Okay, well, the consultant has to say, here's my audit. This is what needs to change. And then the organization has to prove they made those changes and it didn't work, or it succeed wildly. It was a wild success. Or you say, hey, my job is to inject education, and here's the information I presented. This is why it's pioneering information. And then whether that made a difference or not, that's the issue with innovation. It's harder to measure because it's so abstract. And a lot of people just choose to do the other side, which is, hey, we have a hamstring issue, but really it's a symptom of a bigger issue. And they're just playing whack-a-mole. With different injury patterns or issues with athletes.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I would, if I were to be brought in, and I've often suggested this, is like, let's have an educational piece. So we'll talk about things more in general and in some of the research and some of the experience I've had and the successes I've had. But let's also have a needs assessment. So why are you bringing me in? What is the need that we're filling? What is the plan to address that need? What is your implementation process? And then as part of the implementation process, what is the monitoring and evaluation of what we've done, the intervention we've provided? I think that would be, in my mind, that's kind of the perfect job to come into, is let's educate, but let's move forward on some items here that you've expressed need for.
Sure, I think that's great. And one of the things I explain as a consultant myself, and when I suggest using really good, talented people, is the consultant wants to be obsolete in whatever they did for that year so they can move on to another problem. You can't just bring in someone full time. Now, there are some consultants that are like kind of contractors where they're there for the year and they're really intensive. And they know that they're only going to be there for the year and they're going to really bring up the level and standard of care. I've seen those type of people. They live out of hotels and that's all they do is focus. And I think that type of work it's not something I would do, but a lot of organizations benefit from that because they need something in between an employee, right? They know that maybe can't afford that person to put on salary, or that person's not willing to move, but they can do a transitional year, like a gap year, if you will, and have a huge influx of knowledge. So almost like a one-on-one mentorship. So those are things I've seen with some really talented people. Usually they're foreign. They want to come to the U.S. and really just spend a year abroad, or an American is coming out to bringing some fresh ideas to Europe or Australia.
So to finish up, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. What final kind of bits of advice and information would you have to people within organizations who are looking potentially to hire a consultant? How would they move forward on this, and what would it look like?
So I think the first step when you're hiring a consultant is, when I hire a consultant, the first thing I always ask is, how do you work? And this is not about billing or rates and stuff like that. It is to say, how do you operate as a consultant so that there's a good match? And that's what the organization has to decide, is to say, okay, are we going to bring someone in the off season and he's going to plant a seed, and he or she are going to plant a seed and leave? Or is it going to be something where it's continuous, or is it going to be something that the person comes in, comes back 8 weeks later with the solution, and they inject it? So that's the first step. The second step is to really start getting an internal survey of what people think they're good at and what they think could be done better within the organization. A lot of people don't know what's going on in front of them. Never mind they're sophisticated enough to go out and say, well, we're going to shop around the best, ACL guru, or, we're looking, you have experience with electrical muscle stimulation. This year is going to be the year that we're going to make EMS a vital part of our training or rehab. Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. Well, how do they make that decision? They would have first known to have that done years ago if they already knew what they're doing, but it's hard to keep up with everything. So that's the whole purpose, is to start looking at internal reflections of what needs to get better. And then ask around. That's probably the third option, is to say, okay, call up a buddy that's at the same level or close to it and say, hey, we're looking at bringing in this guy for a couple of days. You hired him. I see your team logo. What do you think about this person? And you'll get a lot of surprising answers. A lot of strength coaches in the NFL and different leagues are getting equipment or methodologies being placed from ownership and management, because a lot of these companies that are providing either tools or educational products are going above the heads of the coach because they know that the coach is the barrier. And what that does is they might get the sale for that 1 year, but it dies on the vine because the coach is the one that's going to implement it. So if you go above the coach, you're kind of having a death wish, because what's going to happen a year from now, it's going to die on the vine, and you're going to create enemies, and then the coaches are going to call around and say, don't buy this, or don't listen to this guy. That's the issue. So I don't really support, a lot of these patterns that we're seeing where, these CEOs are connecting with management in sport, because they might make a deal and it might not have nothing to do with actually wins and losses or injuries or performance. It's more of a business move. They're trying to, it's a money exchange or revenue opportunity. So a lot of stuff you see, I say about half is just nonsense. It's just there, smoke and mirrors, trying to make people look like they're busy, trying to get attention for a Wall Street Journal article. And you go in there, like for example, you're in Vancouver and you're dealing with a company that manages sleep, right? Then you go to another, a team, and they say, well, we're using this other vendor. And I'm like, okay, can you show me the data that you're collecting? What are the interventions? And there's nothing. It's very casual. It's just, they bring in a speaker, they do a TED Talk for 30 minutes, and that's it. So, buyers beware, and I think also consultants be careful, because you could go into a no-win situation where you're hired to be the fall guy, to give the management or staff another year, because they can always can the consultant a lot easier than, they're trying to quarantine people getting fired. That's why the NFL is not for long, because it's usually you fire the staff below you to keep you above the water.
Yeah, good point. And I think an important part of this is this idea that, whoever's doing the hiring of a consultant, I think they gotta do their research. They got to talk to different people, like you said. And then when they've identified a need, it doesn't necessarily have to happen right away. But the most important thing would be to secure some budget for that, next step. And I don't know if a lot of people do that, if they go through their end of year budget review and go, okay, maybe we spend less on equipment and we spend more on, intellectual resources.
That's a good point. And here's my rule of thumb. The sequence should always be, but you'll never see it right now, is that the education needs to precede the purchase. What usually happens is, oh, I see this YouTube video or social media clip of someone jumping on a force plate, right? And like, oh, wow, proprietary analytics, and they get all excited. And they say, well, we can do jump testing. We have a Vertec. And I'm like, it's a little bit more than that. There's workflows. There's, force time curve evaluation. What are the interventions? So you always want to make sure that the education precedes the purchase. You really rarely see that. What happens is someone buys something and the sales guy adds like a $2,000 fee to fly out some software engineer to kind of go over how to use it or how to run it, but not how to apply it. Usually what you see with the consultants is like, hey, you bought this, great. Now I want you to use it better, because the consultant either has more years or more people using the system, and they have a better experience of applying interventions, a hierarchy of what's important. Also, usually what happens is it's like you get 10% of the purchase is used for like a weekend workshop. So you fly out to do some sort of user group meeting, and everyone's like at the bar, and it's just like no one wants to be there, because they're forced to do it, and it's usually boring. It's not exciting. Now, there are some user meetups and conferences that are a game changer. And I think you're going to see a lot more of those grow because you're going to need more specialized information. Right now, I don't think you can be hired as an assistant in the NFL, really, unless you're going to have some experience with GPS or technology. Or it used to be like years ago, a movement screen was, an important part of your CV. So whatever those hard and soft skills are, you really got to make sure that there's education that's preceding the implementation. Usually people buy stuff and then they learn about how to use the stuff retroactively. Bad move.
Yeah, well, I mean, these are all really pertinent points and something that people should digest and really establish what their guidelines are for having a consultant, or they may even decide, well, maybe I don't need a consultant, and obviously that's their decision. But I'm interested to hear some of the feedback on our discussion here. I want to thank you for bringing up some really useful information. And any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to, start people, a lot of people say, I don't want to share my secret weapon. And that's fine. I mean, I have people that I'll never share because I know that those people always give me that nice little lead or head start on some stuff that's pertinent to what I'm doing. But I also think that we also have to have some sort of Yelp score to say, hey, is this guy worth bringing in? Because what happens is this stuff perpetuates because no one wants to say, hey, I got conned. Oh, yeah, I'm embarrassed. I can't believe we did that. How many things have been attempted? Like, for example, I bought the strength shoes. Where was the consultant back then? I didn't have so what where I'm going with this, I think there's a lot of education that we need to share, and it has to be a community-driven approach. So I would love, Derek, if once this is up, we're kind of listening to you guys out there, watching and listening to say, okay, how do we get the market better?
That's a good point. So we'll keep pushing people to provide feedback and engage in discussion in different mediums. But thank you very much for your time, Carl, and we'll check in with you soon.
Thanks for having me, Derek.
So I think there were some pretty valid points brought out by Carl about how organizations can really benefit from having an unbiased person come in, assess, provide their opinion on whatever it might be, whatever need that you've identified. And I think that the closer people can get to having that open approach and kind of being transparent about what's happening in their organization, get a second, third opinion on it, I think people will be better off in the long run. There's a lot of insecurity and fear sometimes about, somebody coming in and stealing your thunder, but quite honestly, it's probably the best thing that anybody could ever do. When you get to a point where you think you've got it all covered and you know it all, I think that's when things start to fall apart. So, interesting discussion, and interested, of course, to hear people's feedback. We'll be putting this out there, and again on Facebook, Strength Power Speed, Twitter, Strength Power Speed, and our YouTube channel, and maybe even putting some more clips on Instagram of the discussion. But I think it's a real emerging area where there's so many smart people out there that I think teams could take advantage of. And they may not be people you employ full time. It's just somebody, a one-off, a couple of discussions that sets you in the right direction. So really looking forward to the response here, but I thought it was a great discussion, and we may have to do a couple of follow-ups, and I'd like to get people's opinion who may be on the hiring side and looking for consultants. And what are you looking for? What kind of gaps do you need to fill in your organization that maybe you just don't have time to tackle yourselves? So again, thank you very much from strengthpowerspeed.com, and we look forward to hearing from you.